Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Vietnamese warfare, a hell of a topic that I cannot resume in one video, that is not going to be excruciatingly long, at least for YouTube standards, definitely as gonna seem. Introducing rather this country's history, looking at the main polities that interacted and fought against one another at different times throughout the medieval millennium. Mostly, we will talk, just like we have done recently for Burma, for example, about the second half of the Middle Ages, because it's the better documented. But there was a century-old tradition, definitely dating back to antiquity, in political continuity between these peoples. All right. So, if we look at the modern country of Vietnam, there were essentially two different groups, polities. As they evolved as such. One was Annam in the north, based on the Red River estuary, also known as Dai Viet, that is Great Viet, and we will see now what that meant. That were probably also Vietnamese ethnic stock. The other were the Champa, that had rather, they were mixed naturally, but they had Malay-Polynesian background, and these two polities differed, importantly enough, in levels of development. Essentially, Annam emerged later, at least, as a rebellion from the Chinese Empire in the 10th century, with a consolidation in the 11th. And this had made this region, this polity, already more compact and sort of, in fact, more resembling, from a military point of view, the same Chinese. The Champa had been founded as a polity back in the first centuries CE. There were other significant differences, such as the fact that Annam was a Confucian country, while Champa essentially an Hindu-Buddhist one. Naturally, there were lots of commixtions, and also the geography of the places dictated the north-south axis. The Champa fundamentally were in the coastal area of southern Vietnam, then to the south, to the Mekong Delta, that was at some point occupied by the Cambodian Khmers, that, however, were hit back by the Champas. The latter had also an important naval tradition, especially in medieval times. Later, the Annamites would essentially take over also from that point of view. But historically, it was an interesting naval organization. And today, we will not look at in depth, because it would make the whole thing too long. We would document, broadly speaking, just the essentials of this broader Vietnamese warfare. All right. And when you look at the country's history, you realize that all these polities bounced between foreign domination and independence virtually throughout the entire era, right? And their entire history telling the truth. Occupation of northern Vietnam by the Chinese began with the Zhou dynasty in the first millennium BC. I made a video about Zhou warfare, if you're interested. And, the Chinese had this periodic phases of either crisis or re-expansion, and they had began to hegemonize Annam from, in fact, quite an early era, right? Then you find the Tangs, the Yuan, the Mongols, later on occupying even the entire country, pushing south until the Champa as well. There was an atrocious resistance to all these interventions. Say, Annam was the one that the Chinese managed to maintain the longest under control. It was also because it was the most civilized, but also the one that fundamentally managed to emancipate itself and to resume this concept properly of the Dai Viet, that has to do with the expansion of Annam over the rest of say toward the south, and the Champas that fundamentally were overrun in the late Middle Ages. It's important to note that the term Annam is essentially the westernized version of the Chinese name Annan, which translates to literally pacified south or south of peace, right? And this term was it was used by the Chinese to refer to the region in modern-day Vietnam overall, because from their perspective, of course, things began with a Nam, but it's as if this were just savages going further south that more or less looked at the same thing. Naturally, the thing is more nuanced, but as I often say, this is not the West, right? So we are between a much greater level of documentation for many historical reasons and cultural ones as well. But we know, unfortunately, a few. I want to stress that this video is just an introduction, so I'm not denying, of course, more, say, the presence of an enormous literature actually in these topics. But Annam thus reflects the historical presence of Chinese influence over and control over the region, which was meant to essentially pacify the great kin, right? So everything under heaven. This is the name of China, basically. And later, Annam, as we said, became Dai Viet, or that is Great Viet, which Viet has disputed etymology, basically referred to the people that originally inhabited this area as a group, etc. It starts, it appears in the local writing, just referred to a specific tribe, polity, very early in time, and then it was later applied to this other great expansion, in fact, of the Viet. And so the term Annam is largely used. However, in historical context, it's not commonly used in modern times to refer to Vietnam, but it's quite important to remember what it meant, also from a Chinese imperial perspective. So the Dai Viet originated as a kingdom in the late 10th century. In 968, Ngo Quyen, that was a Vietnamese general, defeated the Southern Han army in the Battle of Bac Dang River, which secured Vietnamese independence from Chinese rule, not forever really, but still to a significant degree that opened to, in fact, a moment of prosperity. Following the victory, in fact, Ngo Quyen established himself as the first king of an independent state, which marked the beginning of the Dai Viet kingdom. And the early kingdom of Dai Viet went through various expansions, changes, the ruling dynasties, territorial shifts over the centuries. And it's basically what would transform itself into the modern-day nation of Vietnam. In spite of the differences between Annam and Champa, we can draw a general picture of Vietnamese warfare, really a quite rarefied one almost, but that is the one we're sort of stereotypically acquainted for the Vietnam War, that in this sense didn't really differ much in terms of, say, foreigner, local, right, strategically speaking, right? Because every time the Vietnamese government fell under the, say, Sino-Mongol invasions, etc., the standard operating procedure was for the army, and as we will see now, an army is also something differently ordered depending on which region of Vietnam we're talking about. But let's say to fall back into the jungles and mountains, right, and carrying out guerrilla operations, harassing the enemy until the time was ripe for an overthrow, which naturally has to happen not just through guerrilla, but recompacting forces. And so, albeit the Vietnamese were quite skilled in guerrilla throughout all their history, and they were one of the single most traumatically violent cultures ever existed historically. And just for those people who think that the Westerners were violent, conquering, aggressive, etc., the difference is that we succeeded, right? While the other cultures lagged consistently behind, and even in decolonization they were fundamentally using Western means to achieve also quite disastrous results, because notoriously the Vietnam War didn't see any winner. Like, the Vietnamese did not win any war, right? They suffered one of the single most disgusting, parts of their history. After that, just nobody won. The U.S. didn't win. China didn't win. The Cambodians didn't win. The Soviets didn't win. Everybody lost. All right. So that's also one thing must be considered. And always in this regard, that of course, if you just strategically, if you resort to guerrilla, you are just declaring that you cannot fundamentally meet with the enemy on equal terms, or at least those terms that allow you to punch right its core out of the country, unless this basically isn't going away. Now, Vietnamese geography does help that, especially in ancient medieval times. If you look at the say the Vietnamese mountain chain, for example, that squeezes the lowlands right along the coast, well, you realize that, say, those are important choke points for supply lines, logistics to be attacked by guerrilla and so on. And so, as we will see now, the main dynamic being being sort of most the better founded statally, right, militarily power that gradually took over what had prior been the more dynamic but still sort of less developed Champa in the south, and essentially following that direction of expansion, right? But when you look at foreign invasions, realize that the unfamiliarity with of terrain, right, the hostility of the environment itself, weather as well, that, as you know, is terrible, with the alternation of, say, frequent rainfall, typhoons, extreme heat, right? It's a tropical climate, also marked by a level of unpredictability. Well, that's something which surely hampered significantly many campaigns, right? This is not to say that if you live in that environment, you're magically, adapted to it. But let's say, and also the same guerrilla that we're talking about before is the declaration that these invaders were more powerful in the first place. But given that war is a political act and that you cannot make just a military consideration if you don't consider the political will in it, of course, all these factors manage to force most occupying nations to forego pursuit of Vietnamese guerrillas and fortify coastal areas. That is also pretty obvious. I mean, in the lowlands and the coastline were the most developed communities, the place that could be better supplied, that had the best land for agriculturally speaking, and so on, right? And this type of warfare was conducted against the Han, the Tang dynasties of the Chinese Empire prior to the latter's collapse, by the way. So we're talking antiquity, that fundamentally the Chinese Empire underwent a very similar fate to the Roman one in terms of internal collapse, right, decentralization, invasions, etc. So these peripheral peoples that had, and that would remain subject to the various dynasties before the Southern Hans, we named them. They are of the age of the 10 kingdoms, so they weren't quite. They were just the southernmost, essentially, of the Chinese dynasties ruling the country, which tells you, of course, how China always had the upper hand when interested, right? There were much more interesting things happening. Also, the Chinese were, in China at the time than, say, going to tame Vietnam, right? But the fact, for example, that the Mongols invaded Indochina and Vietnam specifically 4 times. We have seen it also as far as Burma was concerned, even though it's a sort of to westernmost pictured there. It means evidently that this land had important resources that the new rulers of China were quite interested in, or of course, of control of securing. So, yeah, you can, having watched lots of Vietnam War movies, even if taking place in the 60s, in the 70s of the 20th century, like you have seen conceptually like what the Vietnamese were mostly up to throughout most of their historical warfare, right? And the country is very aptly suited to hit and run tactics, especially again because it has this very long north to south development geographically, and so the mountains fundamentally in the western part, and so from there, right, you can launch attacks. There's very long lines of communications that are sort of obliged passages and wearing out the enemy in very consistent ways. So we can make a very basic distinction of the Vietnamese and the Champa military, right? First of all, as we said, Annam had been part of Chinese influence for over a millennium. Vietnam paid tribute to China and had adopted aspects of Chinese culture, administration, and Confucianism during this period. One factor favoring Annam on the long term was the greater ethnic compaction. Right, the Vietnamese army consisted mainly of Vietnamese soldiers, but as we've seen, the Champa's army comprised a mix of Champs, so this Malay-Polynesian ethnic group, and other local groups, right? And this, of course, had just reflected itself politically, because again, Champa was sort of more fragmented, less statile than Annam. Champa, with its access to the sea, had a strong navy and relied heavily on maritime trade and coastal defenses, because there were attacks from different peoples coming from the sea at time. This also made it difficult for the enemies to launch large-scale invasions by sea. However, Annam had a more landlocked position, which influenced its focus on land-based warfare and fortifications. Thus, Champa had a reputation for its skilled maritime forces, including a formidable navy. They were known for their expertise in shipbuilding, seafaring, naval combat. This allowed Champa to conduct coastal raids, naval battles, and protect its maritime trade routes effectively. Annam, on the other hand, had a larger land army and relied more on infantry, cavalry, and traditional land-based warfare. Annam's army heavily relied on traditional Chinese military strategies as well, such as using densely packed infantry formations and employing crossbows and spears. Champa, on the other hand, incorporated more guerrilla tactics. The bases were similar, we will see now, but they were constantly facing threats from various regional powers, including the Khmers, had to adapt to the challenging terrain, such as dense forests and mountains. This is especially in the case in which the threats came from the north. One could say that Annam had better access to advanced weaponry due to its proximity and trade with China as well. Their soldiers were equipped with armor, shields, and advanced weaponry like arbalists and trebuchet. Champa, being relatively isolated, plus having just access to civilization towards the north, had less access, in fact, to advanced weaponry, and relied more on locally produced weapons like, we'll see now, spears, swords, javelins, but with an emphasis, in fact, on guerrilla and skirmishes. Right. Needless to say, foreign invasions, as different external threats, further shaped the tactical differences between the two cultures. Champa was again frequently under attack from various foreign powers, including Chinese dynasties and the Khmer Empire. And this constant threat from powerful neighbors led Champa to develop defensive tactics, guerrilla warfare strategies, and a strong navy to counter the sea intruders. Annam, however, faced longer periods of stability and less frequent foreign invasions. right? This allowed them to focus on consolidating their territorial control, land-based defenses, and maintaining a standing army. This naturally was happening while they were under somebody else's aegid, which should not be forgotten. But at the same time, it provided them with those means that the less developed Champas really didn't have. Annam had a more centralized monarchy with a well-organized bureaucracy, which allowed for better coordination and control over its military forces. Champa, on the other hand, had a more fragmented political structure, with various noble families vying for power. This often led to disputes and internal conflicts, which affected the overall organization and effectiveness of their armies. Right? As we were saying, there were different sort of backgrounds, different sort of also longer range influences even across the sea. For example, Champa had a strong Indian cultural influence, particularly from the Hindu and Buddhist civilizations that were prevalent in the region at the time. And this influence also extended to tactics, because Champa employed techniques such as elephant warfare, chariot warfare, and archery, which were common in the Indian subcontinent. And Annam, although influenced as well by neighboring civilizations, developed a somehow more distinctive military tradition, which combined elements of Chinese, Vietnamese, and regional indigenous practice. But it's obvious that their infantry and cavalry were influenced mostly by the Chinese military that naturally was the most advanced in the region. And so that's more or less the pattern. The most important military events, also the best documented ones, the thing goes up here, let's say, in scale of importance, both, say, spiritually and materially, regards Annamese military history. It's under the Li dynasty that ruled between 1009 and 1225 that, as we've seen, the Dai Viet began to assert a true independence from China. Li Tai Tho, the first emperor of the dynasty, declared himself the founder of a new Vietnamese state, ending the classical Chinese administration. In fact, the Li rulers sought to establish properly Vietnam as a separate entity for good. Right? This wouldn't be to be given for granted in the first place, because the Chinese were quite powerful, and especially during the Mongol rule, the Vietnamese had in fact resist against the Yuan dynasty that ruled between 1271 and 1368 in China, attempting to incorporate Annam into their dominion. However, Vietnamese generals and national hero Tran Hung Dao successfully repelled multiple Mongol invasions, securing Vietnamese independence. The most important battles are the ones of Bac Dang in 1288. This battle is, let's say, the most famous and decisive encounter between the Vietnamese and the Mongols. Led by the military genius Trang Hung Dao, the Vietnamese forces effectively used a combination of naval tactics and a large system of iron-tipped wooden stakes hidden beneath the water's surface, and this strategy allowed them to trap and destroy a significant portion of the Mongol fleet that attempted to invade via the Bac Dang River. The actual first Mongol invasion attempt in Vietnam had happened 30 years before, the Battle of Dai Viet's northern border between 1257 and 58. The Vietnamese successfully defended their northern border from the Mongols' assault, forcing them to retreat. And then you have the Battle of Yen Tso, 1258. Following their retreat, in fact, the Mongols regrouped and launched yet another invasion, reaching as far as the outskirts of Tang Long, the Vietnamese capital. However, the Vietnamese forces led by Trang Hung Dao once again managed to repel the Mongol troops, who suffered heavy losses. Then you have the Battle of Dong Bo Dao in 1285. This battle instead took place when the Mongols made their third invasion attempt. Despite initial successes, their forces were eventually defeated by the Vietnamese, who used guerrilla warfare and exploited the rough terrain to their success. Later on, we have a Ming-Vietnam War. We are in the late 14th century, when Ming China, under the Zhou Yuanzhang-led Ming dynasty, attempted to reassert control over Vietnam. However, Vietnam put up, again, a strong resistance, particularly under the leadership of the legendary Tran Hon Quan. Despite some Chinese victories, overall, Vietnam still maintained its independence, eventually signed peace agreements with Ming China. There is an interesting anecdote about the 1406 invasion, as China on this occasion succeeded in making Annam province, but the natives carrying on a guerrilla which drained Chinese resources led to several defeats before the province was abandoned in 1427, which was a turning point. But on this occasion, there is an info about many Annamese gunnery instructors being imported in China in the process, which is surprising considering that China had basically invented gunpowder and was essentially the first major power to employ it on a significant scale. The Ming Shi claims that guns were first even acquired by the dynasty from Annam in 1410, but obviously this is not correct. The Chinese made use of guns way before, and it's rather the other way around. That initially the Ming victory, even on Annam, was likely, like in part for sure, due also to likely superior artillery, but it depends also which kind, because of course the Chinese would have had better sort of, I don't know, siege engineering. The Vietnam had historically some important development even in that regard, but of course had lagged behind, especially in the south, and as we've seen, Annam was basically a sort of Chinese at least possession for a long time. So 1427, 1428 specifically is a very important year, because this brought to the Lei dynasty and sovereignty, which further solidified Annam's independence. And so the Lei emperors, to establish their sovereignty, to asserting their rule over also the entirety of Vietnamese territory, also the south. They expanded at some point even in the west, in the region known as Lan Xang, right, that arrives substantially west, right, and also in the continent. And so there wasn't too much there. Admittedly, the most important territories were the Vietnamese one on the Gulf of Tonkin and, generally speaking, the South China Sea. But this capacity of even expanding in the hinterland, the Annamite range as well. These were temporary occupations, by the way, just like in the 70s and the 80s of the 15th century. But it's important just to mention them, explaining what level of ambition even they acquired. The Lei dynasty would rule until the end of the 18th century, so successfully resisting Chinese invasions and maintaining their independence throughout the centuries. If we were to look a bit more, and very much in general, at Vietnamese forces as a whole, right, mixing a bit Annam, Champa, because they weren't really that different after all. There were different influences, but again, the essence, the core of the armies was very similar. We talked about elephants, we talked about war chariots in very, very early days, but generally speaking, Vietnamese armies were almost completely made up of infantry, of foot troops. Right? This is not much a matter of military organization per se. Again, Annam especially, but also Champa had important cavalry forces that we tend to underestimate. These were essentially feudal lords controlling this extensive rice fields, etc. But it's obvious in this regard that, especially in the South, there wasn't much of a social certification. Most people were poor, very poor, and therefore they would fight as infantry in large amounts. And given that very often, as we've seen, Vietnam had to face invasions, these guys were the same guerrilla fighters obliged to abandon the lowlands, taking refuge in the mountains, in the jungle, and carrying out guerrilla. The military organization was likely not standardized. At this point, was rather an amalgamation of what was locally available, mostly on the basis of militias, levies. If any organization was used, it could have been styled after the Chinese masters' organization. Again, there was an Indian influence of some sort, but again, not to the degree that it was a sort of military reform coming from India or whatever. So, of course, everything was pretty naturally happening at a local level. When we look at the composition of this infantry, we can't say that virtually all the local forces were some sort of unarmored foot, right? We can't think there was even too much of it. There are many reasons, primarily patrimonial, but also environmental, right? And large swaths of this infantry would have likely not even been able to maintain the field against heavier troops, especially the invading ones, but say the Lord's cavalry and infantry. We can think of some heavier troops equipped with bamboo weapons and even armor. Also ox hide was another minimal defense. This can be considered as the, top armored infantry of some sort, with 10%, let's say. And a relevant amount of Vietnamese forces was equipped with crossbows, which were somehow typical of the region. The power of these weapons naturally varied substantially. When the crossbow is a term just speaking of the generic structure of this weapon, what it is. So we don't have to think about dramatically advanced crossbow mechanism, but still, right? And this speaks to some degree also of the anti-cavalry bias that Vietnamese forces really had. Not much because they had a lot there on their own, but because the invaders often had this sort of bigger targets, and it was important just to hammer on their own. And then, of course, the weapon was fully functional for local warfare, right? There was some kind of tiger-striped clothing apparently used by these Asian soldiers to really, mimetize in the jungle, just like the animal would do. And these were, in fact, very much the furs of local tigers. At point, we can think at times there were also motives like simply black bands irregularly striped in an intermittent pattern, just as a replica. And the thing still, I think, existed during the Vietnam War. It's still a type of mimesis through this pattern was a thing from very, say, far away in time. Keeping to speak about the Vietnamese infantry, we do not have too much evident sources even here to find the pictures. The non-copyrighted ones is a bit of an adventure, but it's really Vietnam not to offer too much evidence of a local fighting man throughout even the millennium. There is something in some relevance, of course. There's the tracheo pedestal dated to the 7th or the 8th century AD, which can serve as a base, as a model. As we said, armor was whenever it existed, which was not very frequently, to say the least, could be made up of woven bamboo or extremely tough buffalo hides. So resources that, as you understand, you can find to some extent at the time, but these were pre-industrial societies. The surplus was ridiculous compared to ours. So even bamboo and buffalo hide required a lot of work to at least serve the purpose of an armor. And let's say consider the good enough, the fact that there were all these numerous light infantrymen that could viciously engage in guerrilla warfare. But as we said, that is not just an indicator of particular strength of regular forces, say regularly supplied ones, whatever. So of course there would have been at some point a significant military organization. There were cities. The Champas, again, for example, struggled to maintain the control of the Mekong Delta once from the Khmers. They got them back. They lost them, then they got them back. So of course there were some heavier troops, right, with Chinese arms and armor, something else with Indian influence, etc. But the typical local one would be made of this. And the Vietnamese were often a thorn in the side, as we've understood, of their Chinese overseers. Rebellion seemed to pop up every time China's power was threatened. So the system just per se was fairly unstable, especially in the south. The sense was, of course, that the least centralization you have, the least effective military you can afford, because most of the political compaction would happen through this metus hostilis. The weapons employed by the Vietnamese were bamboo javelins, short spears, self-bows, metal machete-like swords. Some of these were used still during the Vietnam War. Think about the jungle, the need just to have this. I mean, even the Americans used those contexts. We talked about the primitive crossbow that would have been, say, especially to defend cities, siege warfare, etc., particularly relevant. It's similar to the Burmese one, and I made a video about, again, medieval Burmese warfare recently you can check out. Even this type of crossbow was so traditional in local warfare that during the Vietnam War, you can find them. The many booby-traps were actually crossbows, all right, that function that same mechanism. And we can think of bamboo shield, right, something like from 90 to 120 centimeters in height, which, considering the past, people being shorter and the Vietnamese not being exceedingly tall on average, was still a considerable type of defense, considering all this missile warfare that we've seen around, right? So one doesn't have to underestimate it. The practicality of retreating in the jungles and hills and conducting guerrilla operations is something you find throughout the entire period, in particular in 1258, when Annam fell completely to the Mongols. The Champa submitted politically as well when their leaders surrendered, but they carried out all these operations against the Mongols for many years and succeeded finally even in expelling them. And this tells you a lot about sort of the temper of these people. And you understand, again, something very basic, very simple, but very effective at the same time, right? People just habituated to make a lot of sacrifice. But also, I think we underestimate the elite, right? The fact that, of course, when we think about the Vietnam War, we enter immediately the mode of, again, decolonization, communism versus, the Western Bloc, etc. So it's like a people's war. A war is always a people's war, but it's also about who leads them, the elites, right? And we tend to, in fact, say, even in this demented rhetoric of the rest of the world being free and the terrible Europeans coming to conquer, whatever, that these guys, elites, were sort of that either did not exist or were sort of saints. This, again, were some of the most brutally ferocious individuals who thought the peasant to be racially inferior beings compared to them. They were much more close to divinity, but not demigods themselves. Of course, you can't think of this peasantry to be extremely dull and to some sort of submitted to this guy's will. And of course, these were the same people that, however, had that important synergy in resisting, after all, to this most evidently external threat. Vietnam in this regard is very well defined by in space as well. So in spite of the large size, the variety, even in landscape, in climate, etc., it sort of knows who's the outsider, right? And as such, and that's what it deals against, sort of automatically. And again, you have the mountains very close, fairly close to the same sea, right? So the possibility of coming back, depending on where you are, of course, along the mountain chains, it's sort of high, right? And the capacity of infiltrating and of having, again, this possibility of cutting the enemy supply lines along the latitude of the country are significant. Naval warfare, again, is something that, especially for the Champa, is significantly documented. They used it as a resource, even just to defend themselves, because, of course, it was some maritime expansion, but there were also other powers that were stronger than them, and so one has to admire the Champa over the medieval millennium for having managed to remain de facto independent until probably the last centuries, when they were absorbed by Annam. That was still somehow more familiar. There were the main divide latitudinally was constituted by the Vietnamese or Annamite range, because that's the thinner part. Then in the north you have probably Annam, and with the Red River, the 12 time Wangs, the Gulf of Tonkin, and then just you have the coastal dimension that develops really as another country, and it's obviously less resourceful compared to the north, that, as we've seen, had more capacity to statalize, to concentrate power, and to, even in the sense of being at the very south of the Chinese Empire, managing to escape its grip, especially in Ming times, again from the beginning of the 20s of the 15th century, and to gather power south. So essentially extending, protracting the Viet Empire as something similar to, I mean, it has nothing to do with it, but like, I don't know, what the Lithuanians did with Ruthenia while they were pressure under the Teutonics in the north, right? They gathered this southern space that at this point was sort of collapsing. In this case, in Vietnam, for just local reasons, for the incapacity fundamentally of adapting to, we are at the thresholds of the modern age, right? To some sort of more stable, statal system. And they overrun it. Because yes, these guys can carry out guerrilla warfare, etc., and it's a mess. But if you're just a closed power, and you're also sort of mixed ethnically with the saying you have, especially through the coast, because at this point the Annamite have a greater naval force that is able to overwhelm the major centers on the Champa coast, fundamentally, up to the Mekong Delta, where the Khmers are, right? But that's where, in fact, the thing stops, and this were the extreme frontier from the Annamite perspective. You see that this fairly thin stripe of coastal land, considering the internal mountains, is not that much of a critical mass, especially if you control just the coast, right? Through the coast, you can simply just get stuff from the sea, right? Not from the interland. And so you can, if you have a strong naval force, you can also resupply these ports from the sea. And so even guerrilla can't quite do much, and that's why eventually the Dai Viet Empire, Vietnam, is formed. Because at the end of the day, civilization, basically to these guys' standards, of course, actually survives, but also takes over, and the rest is absorbed functionally. Also because, of course, the Chinese were pressuring, and it was the same Champa's interest in the sense of the populations that inhabited there to trying to say back that bulwark that the Dai Viet was, without which also the south could be invaded by the Chinese more easily. And China also was compacting, etc. So times change, right? And of course I made it very simple because everything is much more complicated, to say the least. But when we look at the essentials, you may be satisfied with them. I'm making these videos about Southeast Asia also for the Enemies of China series, which I think it's quite important, because as you study a power in its military, you must forcefully know what their enemies were, otherwise you can't properly understand what the whole thing was about. Of course, we're talking about immense spaces, and we will hopefully get also more in depth into this stuff. I don't know when we will make any other video about Vietnamese warfare from this era. I started a couple of years ago actually a series about the Vietnam War, but I interrupted it for technical reasons. We could resume it easily. I thought just was not the time. It's not the temper we should get into at this point. But of course, I'm always willing to deepen this kind of regional scenarios, because they always bring something new, unique, original to the content. And even if I concentrate Europe, it's not that I think that, of course, the West has a prominent role in, of course, in the history of mankind, etc. I'm absolutely open to any other scenario, right? The reason why I don't talk about this more often is that, just generally speaking, it's easier to talk about things you know more, but doesn't mean that it's that difficult just to give a generic introduction in the first place. So that's what I do. It's like when on Reddit they say, "Oh, you cannot know everything." Blah blah blah. It's, China and Europe, Middle Ages, and Antiquity and Modern Age. Well, it's not that difficult if you have some culture or education or expertise or competence in general. Like you can by YouTube standards, which are rather pitiful, historically speaking, you can absolutely and profitably talk all these topics without being considered for this reason inaccurate, right? What we understand, of course, is that accuracy stems exactly from diachronic and comparative capacity, not by being, again, like some people think that history is, and I tell it as a PhD in medieval history, like, you must know just everything that exists on a single topic in order to understand the topic. Because this topic without the other topics doesn't have any meaning, right? And what I fight against as a scholar is exactly this sort of hyper-specialization, which is just a symptom of moral, personal, and cultural paranoia. It's not something people boast. And that's, again, the same old story that but I don't see a bibliographical list, so this content must be unreliable. Well, it may be unreliable for you if, of course, you can't, if you do not know what I'm talking about, because you do not know where to check this, but it doesn't mean that it's historically inaccurate, which is a very different thing, nor that it's historically incorrect. because there is a method here, and if you don't get it, again, or you do not provide with significant criticism, which I never get, by the way, in historical terms, right? People, the greatest type of criticism that I can get is somebody coming, seeing that I'm talking about their country, getting jealous, hysterical, whatever, and saying, this is wrong, point. What is wrong? Sometimes it's not even specified. And that ends, right? I still have to find someone that comes on my videos and say, well, this is wrong because you see in this book, this scholar said this, and you here said this, and it's not quite the thing because this and that and these other sources, but never, ever, right? And let's therefore also stop pretending that the average person is anything remotely close to that, right? And being able just by themselves or by a bibliography to even understand what that bibliography contains, right? So that's the philosophy that I leave you with today. However, this was it. I for today stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.